everyone. Welcome to the International Water Resources Association webinar on global water security issues, management, and techniques for reliable groundwater success. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to take a few moments to briefly introduce our panelists. Today, they include Mr. Simone Grego, Program Specialist, UNESCO, Seo-Hyung Choi, Program Specialist at i-WSSM, UNESCO, Mr. David Adamson from the Center for Global Food and Resources at the University of Adelaide in Australia, Mr. Simon G. Gregg, Institute of Water Education, Delft, Ms. Lily Yu, General Institute of Water Resources and Hydropower Planning and Design for the Ministry of Water Resources, China, and Renee Martin-Nagel, CEO, Ripple Effect, Special Counsel Eckert Siemens, and IWRA Treasurer. This is a webinar hosted by the International Water Resources Association. IWRA is an international network of researchers and practitioners who work on a multidisciplinary range of water resource issues. IWRA provides global knowledge-based forum for bridging principles and geographies by connecting professionals, students, individuals, corporations, and institutions who are concerned with the sustainable use of the world's water resources. Today, the theme of this webinar will be management and techniques for reliable groundwater access. Groundwater is an essential water resource globally, but one that is more difficult than surface water to quantify and assess. This webinar will help the audience to learn from case studies on options for assessing and managing groundwater resources in 3 regions facing water supply challenges. The topics today will include the golden gift of groundwater in Australia, drivers of groundwater salinity and potential for freshwater abstraction on semi-arid coral limestone island in Sri Lanka, a study on zones classification, management, and control methods based on groundwater functions in China. Just briefly, I will explain the format of today's webinar. We will have presentations from each of our speakers, and we will then jump right into the questions. So please put all of your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. With that in mind, I would like to turn the floor over to our moderator, Dr. Mary Trudeau, IWRA lead on water security and a member of the IWRA Smart Water Management Task Force. Mary, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Nirvana, and hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We have some presentations for you by UNESCO, IWSSM, and 3 of the chapter authors of the Global Water Security Publications issues publication, and we will be posting a link. You can access this publication. It's in print form, but it's also available through UNESCO's library. So all of the 3 chapters in detail that are being presented today, you can access online. So we'll take questions for clarification after each of the presentations. If there's something in the presentation that you'd like to expand on a little bit, we'll take those questions immediately after the presentations, but then we'll save sort of broader questions, discussion questions for the end, when all of our presenters will convene in a panel to discuss issues of that you raise and that are raised in their presentations. And we'll have some concluding remarks from Dr. Renee Martin-Nagel. So with that, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Simone Grego, who's the program specialist in the section of groundwater sustainability and water cooperation. It's a division of water sciences in UNESCO. So Simone is currently in charge of a portfolio of projects related to transboundary aquifers and groundwater sustainability. Before joining UNESCO's headquarters, he was UNESCO's regional advisor for natural sciences in West Africa from 2015 to 2020, process coordinator of the United Nations World Water Development Report from 06 to 15, and a program specialist at UNESCO's Cairo office from 2004 to 2006. So I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Simone Grego.
Thank you very much, Mary, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, wherever you are. I will start sharing my presentation. Please confirm that this is visible. And
yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. For the next 8 to 9 minutes, I will briefly introduce the publication we will be discussing today and frame it within the special year in which we are, which is the year of groundwater. But before starting, I would like to sincerely thank IWRA for organizing this webinar and I-WSSM for co-publishing the volumes of the series, and especially all the authors that took time to provide their contribution, in particular the 3 authors that are here today. So a few words about this series. I understand that this will be discussed in more detail in a while, but the GWSI paper series, it's a series that deals with water security and aims at documenting emerging water security issues and analysis, and also by publishing original work of experts. The series is not a purely technical scientific one because it aims at contributing to improving the understanding of the economic, the social, political, technological, and institutional influences on global water security issues. Again, so it's a wide holistic approach. And this is done in connection to global frameworks and agendas like the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, and the Sendai Framework, Africa 2063, the new urban agendas, and others. How does this thing work? Every year, a theme is selected, and around 15 experts are invited to contribute to this theme. And these are selected based on the quality of their abstracts, but keeping in mind also the geographical and the gender balance. It's a work that it's done in cooperation between UNESCO, IWRA, and i-WSSM, which is a Category 2 center of UNESCO. And it's co-published by UNESCO and i-WSSM. So far, 3 volumes have been published, one on water security and the SDGs, the other one on circular economy and water use, and the third one, the one we're going to discuss today, about groundwater. Before discussing a bit more why groundwater, I would like just to briefly, show how water use is projected to grow in the next 30 years. There's the latest estimate published by the World Water Development Report show that the water use is projected to grow by 1% per year over the next 30 years. As you imagine, this is a very, very high number. And the growth is primarily concentrated in emerging economies, lower and middle income countries. And it's the drivers are essentially agriculture, so food production, industry, energy sector, as well as urbanization, municipal and domestic use. And on top of this, there's external drivers, which are population growth, economic development, shifting diet consumption patterns. And when you combine this with surface water scarcity and pressure of climate change, you start seeing how groundwater plays an essential role in the future to ensure that we will be able to avoid a water crisis that otherwise will be with us soon. So groundwater. This volume was published before knowing that this would be a very special year for groundwater. I'll talk about it in a while. But this webinar, it's very, very timely. And let me explain you why. Why is groundwater relevant in general within the framework of the SDGs? Groundwater accounts for 99% of all liquid freshwater of the earth. So liquid freshwater, this does not include ice, frozen water. And as you know, groundwater is critical to maintaining food, water, energy security, to fight against poverty, to create decent jobs. Again, I invite you to read the World Water Development Report edition 2014 on water and jobs. It's a very interesting one. Contributes to socioeconomic developments, to the resilience of societies and economies in climate change. and it plays an essential role also in sustaining a healthy ecosystem. At the same time, groundwater is invisible. You don't see it, it's under our feet. Those who take decision don't see it. And as such, this is often poorly understood, it's undervalued, it's mismanaged and abused. So in spite of the fact that it's extremely abundant, as we just said, groundwater is extremely, extremely vulnerable to overexploitation and pollution. As you can see here in this slide, I just highlighted a couple of the main issues we are observing with groundwater. The first is groundwater depletion, as you know, in several parts of the world, and this map shows it pretty clearly. There is an extreme decline of the groundwater table. And as you might be aware, not all groundwater is renewable. It means that some groundwater is not renewable, and the one that is renewable on a time scale that sometimes is not compatible with human use. Another major issue with groundwater is pollution, because groundwater pollution is a process that is almost irreversible. As you can see from this image that is taken from the World Water Development Report 2022 edition, there are several sources of pollution for groundwater, whether it's mine, landfills, contaminated rivers, industrial sites, sewers, poorly constructed well, intensive agriculture. Groundwater is very, very vulnerable, but at the same time, it's essential to achieve the SDGs and to ensure development. In view of all this, UN Water, which is the platform that brings together UN agencies dealing with water and partners, so NGOs, declared that the year 2022 would focus on groundwater with this motto, making the invisible visible. And this would be the theme of the World Water Day for 2022 and the theme for the year. UNESCO, in view of its experience with groundwater, especially with transboundary groundwater, was asked, together with the International Groundwater Resource Assessment Center, a Category 2 center of UNESCO, to lead the World Water Day campaign for 2022. And this campaign is ongoing. It started in January, let's say it started in March and will last until March of next year. So UNESCO in this capacity is coordinating the organization of and participation to a series of events which are aimed, like the event today, to bring the attention of policymakers, stakeholders, and also general public to groundwater. So to make groundwater from an invisible resource to a visible and properly managed resource. Within this framework, and so we need to keep in mind that this year, it's the year of groundwater within the UN system. And so this is why this webinar and this publication are extremely timely. Here, I would briefly like to highlight the main events that will guide us through the year of groundwater. And everything started, although a bit informally, with the conference on transboundary aquifers in the ISARM in 2021, and then moved through the World Water Day in March 2022, which was focused on groundwater. After that, there was an extremely interesting international conference of the IAH, International Association of Hydrogeologists, on groundwater and the SDGs. Again, this is key, and I want to underline it because it moves groundwater from a purely scientific topic to a development topic. And this conference was able to link the two worlds, the science and the policy. After this, there was the major conference in Dushanbe, the High-Level Water Conference. And in the future, we will see a high-level political forum in New York, which will deal with groundwater. The World Water Week, which focuses again on groundwater, you know that it has a yearly theme. And there will be a session at the General Assembly of the United Nations dealing on transboundary aquifers. The World Water Day will go around groundwater in November. And then, this is where I would like to spend the remaining minute of my presentation, 7th of 8th December, there will be the UN Water Summit on groundwater. This will be the pinnacle of all the events of this year, and it will be co-organized by UNESCO and IWRA together with the UN family. The outputs of these conferences, the outcomes, will feed into the United Nations Conference on Water in March 2023. For those of you who are not aware of it, the United Nations are organizing a major conference, the biggest conference on water in March 2023, which is the biggest conference after Mar del Plata 1977. And the aim of this year of groundwater, and also of the event today somehow, is to contribute to building messages that will ensure that groundwater is well represented at the UN Water Conference and its outcomes. In the next 30 seconds, I would just like to show you some of the events that took place this year in pictures: the launch of the World Water Development Report on groundwater, the World Water Day contest, photo contest, an exhibition of Sebastião Salgado, a famous photographer, on water and groundwater, and a challenge organized by the UN system about groundwater. Finally, before closing, I would like to again highlight that there will be the Groundwater Summit in 7th and 8th December in Paris at UNESCO headquarters, organized by UNESCO on behalf of the whole UN water system. This is the link. I will paste it in the chat in a while. I will invite you to have a look. And for those who are passionate for groundwater, and I'm sure there are a lot in the around 80 people that are attending now, I invite you to have a look at the website, and in case your organization is interested, to apply for a side event for the 6th of December. So with this, again, before closing, I would like to thank the organizers, IWRA, i-WSSM, and the speakers today, the participants, and I wish you good continuation of the seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simone. I think we had a bit of a technical issue and your slides weren't progressing. So maybe, yeah, just go back one more.
Sure, with pleasure. But they were scrolling on my screen. I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
Did you see this?
Yes, this is the one it seemed to like.
That it got stuck here. Apologies. Okay. So now these are the few pictures I was mentioning on the event that took place so far in this year of groundwater, with the World Water Day here on the left, the World Water Day photo contest, an exhibition of Sebastião Salgado. And then this is the in progress flyer of the UN Water Summit on groundwater. And I invite everybody to have a look at the website, and I will paste it on the chat now. And if they're interested, if their organization is interested, to apply for a side event, for the pre-summit side event on the 6th of December. And this closes my presentation. I hope you saw all the slides now.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So now I'd like to introduce Mr. Seo Choi, who is a program specialist at UNESCO's i-WSSM. So that's the International Center for Water Security and Sustainable Management. So Seo is also a PhD candidate in Seoul National University, and his main research interests, include climate change adaptation, the water energy nexus, disaster risk management, and urban water management. So with that, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Seo.
All right. Hope you guys see the screen well, and if you don't, please let me know. And good morning and good afternoon and evening, everyone, and thank you very much for your kind introduction. As Mary introduced, this is Seo Choi, and I am a program specialist at UNESCO i-WSSM. And it is my great pleasure to present in this IWRA webinar. And today, I'd like to give an introductory presentation on our global water security issues. So before we go into the details, and I'd like to introduce our institution, the UNESCO i-WSSM, briefly. So UNESCO i-WSSM, as Mary introduced it briefly, it stands for International Center for Water Security and Sustainable Management. And this is a Category 2 center under the auspices of UNESCO and founded in 2017 and based in Daejeon, city of Daejeon, and in South Korea. The center was the center has three main scopes, including research, education, and international cooperation. In research section, we conduct water, energy, environment nexus to support water-related decision-making process in the context of sustainability. And in education sector, we provide tailored education programs for developing countries related to water security themes. And today, we also published several publications, including GWSI series. So today, I will focus on our publication, the global water security issues. The global water security issues, we call the GWSI series, is a co-publication between UNESCO and UNESCO i-WSSM. And IWRA has cooperated since the second series in 2019. And the publication aims to share the current issues and diverse perspectives and to contribute towards achieving water security in the long term. The general process of the series follows: first, the steering committee selects theme in each year. And second, the proposals are collected and the selected blinded by strictly following UNESCO's gender equality and the African priority. And of course, they also balance the geographical gaps. And lastly, the selected papers through the peer reviewing and revision process. And all the design and printing layouts, then we finally published the GWSI series. The first series was published in 2019 with the theme of water security and the sustainable development goals. And 18 authors from the 11 different institutions were involved and from all over the countries. And the second series was entitled with water reuse within a circular economy context, and in total 34 authors with 42% of female authors participated. And the third series, which is today's webinar theme, the role of sound groundwater resources management and governance to achieve water security, was released in the last year, and today's the speakers wrote the chapters of the series. And the next series is on water security and cities, integrated urban water management. 48% of female authors and 17% from African authors were included. The series is expected to be published in this fall, and we will have a launching event on November. So please stay focused on IWRA, UNESCO, and i-WSSM websites or social media so that you don't miss this event. And finally, this is my last slide. And the next series, which we are planning to be published in the next year, is titled "We're Making Water Decisions for Climate Change Adaptation." So it includes chapters of governance and MBS and land use planning and risk management and public engagement. So the publication is now under review and will be published in the next year. So that's all I have prepared for today. And I hope you understand the general procedure of the series. And so if you have any further questions related to the i-WSSM or the GWSI series, please feel free to reach me. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the insightful presentation. And thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Seo, for that overview. And so again, just a reminder that all of those publications are available through UNESCO's library. And way back early on in the chat, you'll find links to the publications. And if you don't see those, just let us know again in the chat and we can repost those. So getting into the publication specifically about groundwater, the series 3, as Seo mentioned, we now have 3 presentations by authors of chapters in the series 3 publication. And we're going to start with Dr. David Adamson, who is an agricultural and resource economist specializing in decision-making under risk and uncertainty. He's employed with the University of Adelaide in Australia. David's been commissioned to work on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan and the Garnot Climate Change Review. So David's presented his research findings to a number of different organizations, OECD, the World Bank, FAO, and he's helped shape water allocation strategies for Europe's largest dam in Portugal to mitigate climate change effects. And he's also worked across Spain, Italy, the United States, and the UK. So it's my great pleasure to hand the stage over to David.
Thank you, Mary. Good day, everyone. How's it going? All right, without further ado, let's get in and show you some bad things economists can do about groundwater. I'll just minimize this myself. All right, sorry, a second. There we go. All right, the objective of this talk is to illustrate the economic value of highly secure groundwater to not only offset infrastructure inequality within a region, but also offset water supply variability, both under current climates and future climate scenarios. But first, let's set the background to where I am from. I play in the Murray-Darling Basin. That's that little purple area here. It looks like a kidney and it has the same function. It drains water and salt from our continent. It's our third largest river basin, over 1 million square kilometres, and we experience the second most variable inflows in the world in this. This makes agriculture exciting because sometimes we have water and often we don't. The Murray-Darling Basin is divided into two main parts. The southern basin down here, this was the area developed first. It has a higher rainfall. This area near the snowy skiing is where we have our snow, and we've got the ability to provide inter-basin transfers into the southern basin that flow along the Murrumbidgee and the Murray River. This is the area that's had significant capital investment. Not only is 73% of the entire basin storage in this area, but the entire river system has a series of locks, weirs, and barrages to prevent saltwater intrusion. This is where we find our permanent plantings, a lot of dairy. The northern basin was developed later. There's far less storage up here. Up here, the seasons really matter. We are highly opportunistic cropping systems, mainly annuals. If there's water, we'll plant. If there's no water, we don't plant. Understanding how decision makers respond to these signals is very important. How we allocate our resources in different production systems is very important. What I'll be talking to you about here is what's known as the current diversion limits, roughly about 15,700 gigalitres of water, mainly comprised of surface water, 13,350, and 2,300 gigalitres of groundwater. You can see the breakup here with the surface water for the northern part of the basin and the southern basin. What I'll be talking to you today is about what's happened to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, where we have defined a new sustainable diversion limit, the SDL. What you'll see here is we're anticipating to deal with water over-allocation by removing about 3,200 gigalitres of water. A gigalitre of water is 1,000 megalitres of water, which is 1 billion litres of water or 111 acre-feet of water. What's less known about the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is it allows for an increase of groundwater of about 929 gigalitres. We can see the reallocation greatly affects the southern basin, and the northern basin gets a lot more groundwater. Why are we getting a lot more groundwater? Because currently, the best information we have, we can see what's happening in the northern basin for use, the southern basin for use. Here's the current diversion limits. We're increasing them up to there in the north. Basically, we're getting nowhere near what's considered the sustainable extraction limit in groundwater. For the southern basin, we see the extraction limits are there in the current diversions and increasing up to there in the sustainable diversion limits. Once again, there's more groundwater to be utilised. So, why is this important? As I mentioned before, we have highly variable surface water supply. The Murray-Darling Basin's motto needs to be drought is coming, and apologies for there of all Game of Thrones fans. From 1995 to 2010, we experienced the Millennium Drought, which nearly broke the system entirely. Our surface rights are designed to mitigate some of this unreliability of supply, but it's not enough. climate change is anticipated not to be kind to Australia. The question we then have to ask is, what is the value to more and highly reliable groundwater in the Murray-Darling Basin? To do this, I constructed a constrained welfare optimisation where I'm maximising irrigator profit, that is including of all fixed and variable costs. We can model 22 different commodities and production systems, both annual and perennial. We model that for use in both surface water and groundwater. The model is subject to a whole lot of biophysical realities. We can't move water to certain areas. There are water flow networks that must be met. There are institutional barriers, water trade rules, environmental targets and pollution targets for both under the CDL and SDL. And we've got different types of water being modelled here, what's currently available, and 3 different climate scenarios. And we model the land available for irrigation. The big stuff which I do in this area is playing with the state contingent approach to risk and uncertainty. This is work first initiated by Aaron DeBrew and later by Bob Chambers and John Quiggin. The reason I like it is it allows us to model explicitly what happens under alternative states of nature. I can now model how a farmer responds to a drought. I can now model how they respond to a wet year and what they do in a normal year. I can represent how our production systems change, how we plant areas when there is water and how we don't plant when there's not. I know the amount of water we need to grow different crops. We can model their behaviour when that water is not available. This provides great insights when I start talking about the frequencies of these states and how they can change. Not only can I model the change in their frequency, but the description of the states to represent climate change. Well, enough about that. Let's see what happens. If I go to the current diversion limits, we can see how water is currently being used both in the groundwater, in the surface water, in the northern basin, the southern basin, and the surface water use there. We see what happens with SDLs. More groundwater allows us to expand different production systems. And we see the effect on surface water use with a reduction in the area being utilised for dairy. And I can do this for my 2 climate change scenarios. These are 450 parts per million by 2050 and 2100, and we can see how investments change. And I can also do what's called the drought states, where the droughts become far more frequent. I mentioned climate change wasn't going to be nice to Australia. The current estimates is we should be expecting 20% of the time to be in drought. That's supposed to rise to 75% of the time we'll be in drought. Drought becomes the new normal. How we allocate our resources to deal with that is very important. Because we can work out how we allocate land, we can work out the economic return. The first thing we see there is under current diversion limits, we're making about $241 million off groundwater in the northern basin, 300 or nearly 400 million in the southern basin from groundwater. We can see the surface water and values there for about $3 billion. First thing you notice, if we move to an SDL, actually we're far better off. Greater reliability in groundwater allows us to make a lot more money. Actually, we're about $200 million better off by adjusting to better systems for the environment and a better use of groundwater over surface water. We take away that unreliable nature of the surface. Now, 2 climate change scenarios, we quickly see the loss in money associated with surface water being compounded now in the northern basin. We can also see the value increase the groundwater going forward. The same thing happens again in the second climate change scenario and the third climate change scenario, where we now really see the impact on the surface water income. These are important things to understand, what value the resource is to different parts of the place, to a basin, and who has access to them. What you find as we move forward from the CDL to the drought states is the proportion of economic profit made increases from about 8% all the way up to 14%. groundwater becomes more and more valuable, becomes golden for those that own those rights. We can see that represented here. We do get the logical first thing that occurs in economics when supply is increased, that the return you make per unit falls. But as the scarcity of surface water increases, we rapidly find the groundwater value increases dramatically. Groundwater is gold, especially in the Northern Basin where we have a lack of infrastructure to supply. We have a lack of reliable access to grow different crops. So groundwater has the capacity to deal with inequality, both to negate the spatial problems associated with infrastructure in large areas, the ownership of resources tied to that infrastructure. We can break those molds. We can transform production systems and generate wealth in regions. And it can deal with climate change on the proviso that we surely understand groundwater's limits to prevent intergenerational inequality from degrading the aquifers. Groundwater is golden if we use it correctly, but it can't be a gift. Knowing who gets it and why and how much they need to pay for it is important. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you, David. Can you explain which water abstractors are losing volumes? And I think we saw a slide on that, but how it's decided, like who loses and how is that implemented in terms of water allocation?
Oh, and the buyback. What we had is two major programs to rebalance the water back to the environment. We had significant over-allocation, which led to things like blue-green algae, black water, all those sort of wonderful things that cause environmental harm. It was a long and arduous process. A lot of money was stumped up. Two programs were introduced. One, rights were bought willingly off farmers who wanted to sell. It was willing, they were not forced. And the second was invested in water use infrastructure. That, of course, we know by the Jevons and rebound effect doesn't really work that well. And that program has now been abandoned and they may go back to buybacks to get the last amount of water back for the environment.
Okay, great, thank you. And we can get to other questions that that the audience members may have. Please do enter them into the chat because we'll have time for a panel discussion afterwards. So thank you, David. And next, I would like to introduce Simon Craig, who's an early stage researcher with a background in meteorology, mathematics, hydrology, and water resources. His master's of science thesis focused on the assessment and numerical modeling of groundwater and abstraction potential of a coral limestone island, which we'll hear more about. And currently he's employed by the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. He supports the development of an island-scale groundwater flow and solute transport model for karst limestone island. And Simon aims to continue in this trend, focusing his career on the sustainable development of groundwater resources in small island developing states, known as SIDS, in adapting to global and climate change. So welcome, Simon.
Yeah. Thank you, Mary. Good morning and greetings, everyone. As I said, my name is Simon Craig, and today's presentation is based on the drivers of groundwater salinity and potential for freshwater abstraction on a coral limestone island. All right, so as I stated, groundwater is the main source of freshwater supply on the island. However, the volume is limited by the landmass itself, which is and Delft is a very small island. It has been observed that there is saline water at shallow depths, and concerns for the island is that its population is growing, both its permanent residents and an increase in the number of visitors to the island. Additionally, there are concerns that climate durability is going to affect the future availability of groundwater resources on the island. As such, the objectives of the research was to evaluate the distribution of fresh and saline waters on Delft Island. Additionally, the abstraction potential of the groundwater reserves. and also explain the distribution of fresh and saline waters on the island. From what we know, as all other small coral limestone islands, freshwater exists as a lens, groundwater exists as a lens of freshwater overlying saline waters. The aquifer characteristics are cast limestone and is overlain by unconsolidated sands, mostly on the coastal areas. To get the information on the island, we used 3 different methods. Firstly, geophysical surveys, where we conducted 20 vertical electrical soundings around the island. Additionally, hydrochemistry and isotope analysis based on 49 ground and surface water samples that were collected, and numerical modeling and scenario analysis to understand the abstraction potential of the island. The vertical electrical soundings highlighted that there was fresh water mainly in the second layer on the island before transitioning into saline waters at shallow depths. In most instances, fresh water was only up to a depth of approximately 2.5 meters, and these are more in the sands. When we were looking at the limestones, they existed like in pockets, but they weren't very consistent, were mostly shallow. The chloride concentration and delta O18 analysis highlighted that there was preferential recharge on the island. Groundwater was mostly of meteoric origin. In surface water samples, evaporation, the effects of evaporation based on Rayleigh fractionation, and the seawater mixing were easily recognized. Additionally, the increases in chloride concentration were caused mostly by the mixing of groundwater with the saline water at the lower and slight instances of evaporation. A spatial distribution of the chloride content as well as deuterium isotopes highlighted. And to the left, we have groundwater samples that the groundwater samples were mostly rainwater dominant, whereas as opposed to the surface water samples that were mostly, they were a mixture of both evaporation and salinization. Based on information that we collected and laboratory analysis, we created a conceptual model of the island. Based on, you could see the siphon classification on the whole island, and it highlights where we have mostly for fresh water within the sandy areas, a bit of nitrate contamination, but it was not the focus of this paper. And additionally, brackish water at very shallow depths. It is highlighted that the recharge rates and flow directions are based on a recharge assessment that was based on the soil type that were found. And additionally, the computed hydraulic head in the wells. And there's some uncertainty in our results due to the lack of data. And we could see in some instances where we have, it's denoted by the question mark that we had here because we still need a bit more analysis in these areas. Our numerical model on the island focused mostly on the abstraction potential, and we did a comparison based on vertical abstractions, which are points or point abstraction, versus distributed abstractions or more horizontal wells. To note is that the cross-section that we have highlighted, it goes through the island and the one of the well fields to the east of the page near C prime. Additionally, the model was also based on using the equivalent porosity method approach. To our left of our screen, we have vertical abstractions, whereas to the right. Our scenario analysis highlighted that the aquifer has low potential for abstractions. And in many instances, as long as we start exceeding 5 meters cubed per day of abstractions, we end up with upconing. So upconing is more prevalent from point sources, and distributed abstraction only assists in lowering the rates of upconing. However, it does give you the same volume of water, but for a longer period of time. And also based on the location, lateral saltwater intrusion is possible. And this was in the case of the well field that we simulated a distributed abstraction method via. The sensitivity analysis highlighted the groundwater head is more sensitive to changes in recharge and uncertainties in hydraulic conductivity. The thickness of the transition zone is more sensitive to uncertainties in the dispersion factors, and the thickness of the freshwater lens is more sensitive to changes in the dispersion factors and recharge. Overall, it was confirmed that the freshwater lens is susceptible to rainfall variability and rising sea levels. And this is based on the fact that during the dry season, several wells turn a bit saline and brackish. Additionally, the surface ponds on the island are all saline. They turn saline during the dry season. And with rising sea levels, we're expecting that there's going to be a loss of landmass and thus reducing the area for the freshwater to be stored. The results also highlighted that alternative means are necessary to meet the water demands of the growing population on Delft Island. Currently, they have adopted a bit of desalination. However, the volume of water produced isn't sufficient to meet all of the demands on the island. So it serves as a supplement to what you get from the wells. Potential methods are artificial recharge, and it was learned after our initial assessment that the next stage of the research on the island was for potential methods of artificial recharge on the island. As highlighted, horizontal and distributed abstractions would be one way forward. However, this is in supplement to another sort of, it's only a supplement, sorry, and also rainwater harvesting. Initial attempts have been made on the island to do rainwater harvesting. However, we haven't been seeing much progress as it is not very prevalent. So it's one of the ways forward to meeting their freshwater demands. I am going to thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions that you may have at this point.
Great, thank you, Simon. We do have one question about the model that you used for modeling the distribution of salinity and what type of water is used to recharge the groundwater table.
You said, just repeat the question, please, sorry.
What type of water is used for recharging the groundwater?
Oh, it is rainwater. Rainwater naturally infiltrates into the ground.
Okay, great. And there was a question about the choice of for modeling the distribution of salinity.
All right, so we used mudflow and equivalent porosity method, and it's simply because we didn't have any sort of K values or any sort of hydraulic conductivities for the island, or any information on the distribution of fractures or any sort of thing. So we decided to use that method with isotropic K values as we went along. And then we used, with the model, we would have gained areas based on the recharge that we would have calculated for the island of where you're going to have fresh water accumulating. And then from that point on, we then modeled in time, at least 10 years, to see what is going to happen as if it is that the changes in rainfall or not.
Okay, great. And what are the artificial water topologies that you're suggesting for water harvesting?
All right, so, well, actually that's two things. So if you're talking about the artificial recharge aspect of things, there are areas on the island where it is that there's only a conservation area, so it's only animals are allowed on the area. And if it is, and also in this area, there was some vertical electrical soundings that showed that there were pockets of fresh water there. So with further understanding of that area, it is potentially one of the areas where they could use us to store more groundwater and then transfer to other areas, since that there is no anthropogenic influence in that area. As we relate to rainwater harvesting on the island, we have seen from our from our surveys around the island, there were a few large tanks that were supplied by the government and some private donors. However, they're not very prevalent along the whole island. And it is possible that in cases of maybe short rainfall events that won't contribute to recharge, that they can be collecting some of this water towards their daily needs if possible, and thus removing some of the pressures that you're taking from abstractions on the floor, from the ground.
Great, thank you. And there's a question, but I'm going to save this for the panel about groundwater management, and other than the technical side, so modeling or the economics, what are the concerns for policy regulation, funding, social culture? So some requests for some pretty, I guess it's open-ended question for some advice on groundwater management that we'll get into with the panel. So thank you very much, Simon, for your presentation.
You're very welcome.
And next, I'd like to introduce Lily Yu, who's a professor, level senior engineer in the General Institute of Water Resources and Hydropower Planning and Design at the Ministry of Water Resources of China. She has a PhD in water resources engineering from the University of Florida in the United States. As a technical leader, she's completed a number of national and regional level projects in China, including the National Groundwater Utilization and Protection Planning, which we'll hear more about, National Groundwater Resources Assessment, the Active Groundwater Overexploitation Control in North China, among others. She's also an active participant in the international water resources community, serving as a committee member of the IWRA and Deputy Secretary General of the China chapter of the IWRA. So it's my great pleasure to hand the floor over to Lily.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Let me share the screen. Okay.
Perfect.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So about today's topic, groundwater is essential water source for China's economic and social development. And the large-scale exploitation and utilization of groundwater has resulted in some serious problems. Some regions are facing actual drainage damage and mining environmental and geological problems. So we are trying to find a more reasonable way to utilize and manage groundwater. Firstly, it's about the background. China is a big country, and different part has different climate characteristics, well, which means the natural conditions of groundwater resources have huge variations in different regions. The average annual quantity of renewable groundwater resources in China is about 800 billion cubic meters, and the quantity per kilometers of renewable groundwater resources increases from the west to the east and from the north to the south. And for the plain regions, 59% renewable groundwater resources comes from precipitation infiltration, and 16% from the leakage of rivers and lakes, 6% from subsurface flow from hilly areas, and 18% from irrigation, infiltration, and other water supply sources. Well, due to different climate and hydrological conditions in different areas, regionally, the groundwater recharge is also quite different. The majority of groundwater in most areas of China derives from precipitation, which accounts for more than 70% of groundwater volumes in most areas. But however, in the northwest region, there is little precipitation. And then more than 40% of renewable groundwater resources are recharged by the leakage of rivers and lakes. And another 30% are recharged by irrigation water. About groundwater use, China's groundwater supply reached its maximum value around 2010 at more than 110 billion cubic meters, which accounts for 18% of the total water supply, particularly in some northern provinces where the groundwater supply reached over 60% and even 70% of the total water supply. And after 2010, due to the strict management, groundwater exploitation showed a downward trend. And of course, the intensity of groundwater use in different regions are very different. So considering the important role of functions of groundwater, not only for human beings, but also for the ecosystem, we did some research to divide the groundwater function zones. There are two levels for groundwater functional zones as primary and secondary levels. The primary function zones are divided into three categories. That's the protection zone, reserve zone, and the exploitation zone. They mainly reflect the interconnection between water use for economic and social development and ecological and environmental protection. Well, within this three primary level framework, and based on their main functions, three categories are further divided into 8 secondary function zones. The protection zones comprises an ecological fragile zone, geological and environmentally sensitive zone, and the groundwater conservation zone. The exploitation zone consists of a centralized water supply zone and a distributed exploitation zone. And for the reserve zone, it includes the emergency water supply zone, water reserve zone, and unsuitable exploitation zone. So as for the classification results for the primary zones, 67% of the land in China is the protection zone for groundwater. 18% is the exploitation zone, and the remaining 15% is reserve zone. And for the secondary groundwater function zones, a total of 4,886 secondary functional zones for groundwater are recognized across China. In the hilly areas, the groundwater conservation zone accounts for 74%. In the plain area, the distributed exploitation zone and the non-exploitation zone are the main prominent, taking up 43 and 31 of the plain area. Well, these classification results reflected that the plain area is the main area for groundwater exploitation and utilization, except where there are centralized water supply zones in towns, industrials, and mining businesses. Distributed exploitation is the main approach for groundwater exploitation in China. And in addition, there is a large area for saline water in the plain area, which is classified as unsuitable exploitation zone. So about the management, so based on this classification, we determine the control indicators of groundwater exploitation and the groundwater table. So generally speaking, the groundwater exploitation, I mean the amount of what we can take from the aquifer in the plain areas, we always adhere to the principles of maintaining the balance of groundwater recharge and discharge, meeting the water demand for the natural environmental, retaining sufficient strategic reserves of water sources. So for the top line, we considered a portion of groundwater has to is kind of inevitably be consumed in drainage and evaporation. So groundwater exploitation for human use should not exceed 90% of the total recharge. And the sustainable yield in ecological fragile zones and coastal zones should not should not over 50% of the total recharge. And groundwater exploitation in hilly areas may reduce river base flows. So in this way, groundwater exploitation in hilly areas should also consider surface water exploitation in order not to cause a significant decline in surface runoff. And for the control indicators of groundwater table, mainly it considers the needs for maintaining the a good water cycle and also the good ecosystem. Well, currently the groundwater overexploitation exists in many areas, and the groundwater table has been much deeper than the desirable standard. So the control indicators groundwater tables at different stages should be determined based on the current status of each zone and the process on governance and the protection of groundwater from the overexploitation. So very brief summary, groundwater is widely distributed in China, and this research focuses on groundwater management based on donation process. And the classification of groundwater function is based on the division for a basic unit. Each basic unit could be assigned a certain groundwater function. 67% of the land is protection zone, 18% is exploitation zone, and the remaining 15% is reserve zone. And the primary exploitation zone cover over 20% of the country's area and take up about 25% of the country's groundwater resources. But the quantity of exploitation in this kind of zones accounts for more than 80% of the total national use. And a set of control indicators of groundwater management in function zones has been formulated, indicating control indicators, groundwater exploitation, and groundwater table, targeted on the gap between the current status of groundwater system and the protection objectives. Some feasible solutions need to be proposed and implemented to fulfill this target. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Lily. I don't see any specific questions to follow up. I would like to remind everyone that you can access the publication through UNESCO's library, and we've posted the link to that within the chat. And now I would like to invite everyone on screen to participate in a panel discussion. And again, I'd like to invite people to share your questions in the Q&A. And there's, I guess, a couple of themes developing. So as I mentioned, I'm going to start with the question about, besides the technical side of things, what is your advice in terms of groundwater management? To implement, there's a couple of questions about how to implement groundwater policy, and where do you start, really, especially with respect to nations that may not have access to the resources that, for example, Australia and the United States and Canada do. Is there anyone who would like to start with that? And I know, Simone, you have a lot of experience as well in developing countries. Would someone like to start?
Then I will go ahead first. So in a lot of countries they are highly depends on groundwater for their water resources, such as a lot of countries in South Asia and Middle East country, they use a lot of groundwater. But the real problem is, as Simone mentioned in the earlier, that when groundwater is contaminated, it's really hard to reverse it. It's irreversible. So besides any technology or infrastructure, you have to know what you're using it. So once you overuse it and once you contaminate it, and it has a lot of cascading impacts and a lot of impacts to the ecosystem and other sectors. So so I think it has to be achieved through governance and public engagement. And for this, a lot of education is needed, especially for developing countries.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Especially with an economist on the panel. As you just mentioned, we need to work on governance systems, but how much of a role does price play? For example, if groundwater were to be priced at a higher level, would that help to preserve it because people would use less of it?
Here you need to be very, very careful. There's a combination of things going on here. One, price doesn't work by itself. You can charge anything, but if you can't restrict access, then you've got the situation where water's being stolen left, right, and centre. So, property rights are one of those wonderful things economists like talking about, like taxation. But if you don't enforce them, you don't look after them, they're very difficult to provide any benefits whatsoever. The real question you have to then start asking is, what do you want society to be? Who owns these rights and why? How do you prioritise those rights for different parts of the world? We know that agriculture, by and large, gets about 80% of the water. But we also know that urban areas need that water and they value it far more highly than the returns you get from irrigated commodities. So taking time when you start using those careful concepts about understanding how much water you actually need to keep the aquifer preserved so it's not being degraded, how you then allocate the priorities to going to urban areas or other activities that are considered more important, and down on and so forth. That's a question for the individual countries to pose, because we all have different needs and have different perspectives on this sort of stuff. Price is one aspect, but you can't do it just by price.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to comment on advice in terms of in addition to the technical? Yeah, Lily.
Okay. About the questions just now, I think increasing the price may be helpful to control the groundwater use to restore the groundwater overexploitation. But sometimes it is really very difficult to be implemented. Like in China, because the farmland is not like the European, like the American. Most farmland is operated by very small, individual families. So each family is only own very small scale of farmland. And there are many wells. So firstly, it is very difficult and it is very costly to, if we want to raise the price, if we want to collect the groundwater use money, we need to measure, to install the metering system. And because there are so many wells, it is really difficult to install the equipment for each individual wells. And it is very costly to do this metering and to do operation. And also we are facing the individual farmers. Sometimes we need to balance our profit and the water resources management target. So sometimes that's the challenge we are facing. That could be an effective way, but just maybe difficult to implement it in some place.
Lots of complexities to consider. Simona, I think you also had.
Yes, Mary. Thank you very much, and thanks for the other panelists for the answers. I mean, there are a couple of things I wanted to add to the debate. I mean, this might take hours, but I'll try to be short. The first one, and I try already to provide an answer on the chat to Venny on this. It's the conjunctive management approach, which is not necessarily a technical thing, because the colleague was asking about what besides technical it can be a concern. And this is actually a concern in the sense that at times, actually very often, groundwater and groundwater issues are addressed as like in a sealed box. And same for surface water issues. And while the conjunctive management approach allows to see to have an holistic view on the overall system, it does not apply only to groundwater and surface water, but in this particular case, it's something that's gaining momentum. And there's several major projects funded on this, and it's an essential tool in order to make sure that the water-related issues, whether it's groundwater or surface water, are addressed in an holistic way. UNESCO published something last year. There's the link in the answer I provided on conjunctive management specifically. And there are a few projects in which we are trying to adopt this approach. One is the Greta project, which arrived at the 3rd edition. There's again the link there. One of the issues that at time it's faced is the transboundary dimension of all this, in the sense that it's already difficult within a country to have groundwater people and surface water people meet and discuss together. When this gets on a transboundary level, the things is even more complex. So it's challenging, but it's essential to address water security. And then the second thing, and this again opens another big parenthesis, is on availability of data and knowledge. One of the main issues of groundwater that I briefly mentioned in my presentation is that often the resources is unknown. Aquifers are not well characterized, and often there's basically no data at all, but still these are used and misused and polluted. So one of the main steps that has to be done when addressing the issues at the aquifer level, it's a proper mapping of the aquifer, the vulnerability, the pressures, and so the data part is an essential part that is sometimes overlooked. Sometimes more emphasis is given to the technology part in order to extract better without actually knowing what we are doing. And again, the transboundary dimension here kicks in the sense that it's very difficult to address transboundary groundwater related issues, in the sense if you don't see the resource, it's difficult to know what impact your abstraction on one side will have few hundreds or few thousands kilometers away in another country. So this 3 elements: conjunctive management, availability of data, and transboundary, I wanted to add them to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, great, Simon.
Yes, I'd also like to add, well, the monitoring aspect of things, because in many instances, there is no monitoring that is ongoing in many developing countries, like in most of the Caribbean, the Pacific Islands. And without any sort of monitoring, you don't have any sort of information on how the resource is actually being used. Although it is that we understand that groundwater itself is invisible because we don't have much information on the aquifer characteristics. By understanding how water is being used, we have more insights on how it is that we can manage what is actually happening. And unless there is some sort of drive for more monitoring practices in developing countries, like with lower like financial resources towards it, is something that we also have to be very mindful of, like in moving forward.
Great, thank you. Anybody else? We'd like to mention also there's one of the other chapters in the series 3, the groundwater publication, about kind of grassroots development of monitoring systems, if there isn't one in place, mobilizing local knowledge to at least build some foundation of knowledge on groundwater, whether it's from levels in personal wells, that kind of thing. may be the start of an information basis for decision making. Before
Can I ask another question? Do we have time for another question for the panel?
Yeah.
I'm going back to Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize winning work on governing the commons, which grew out of her study of groundwater use in California. And I'm wondering how the panel feels about gathering stakeholders together and having them manage the groundwater as a commons.
I would start off by asking them, if it is that we have the managers doing it, where do we get the voice of those who are using it inside of the whole aspect? Because if it is that those who are abstracting and pricing and sending out, do they then also have all the say on how the water is distributed? Who has access to how much of it, when they, and things like that? That brings in another set of questions.
That's a good point. Right? And who gets included?
I think while Ostrom was talking there about the bottom-up approach about how you manage resources, I think there's also the need for that top-down level. As it's already been pointed out, the conjunctive nature of the resource as it goes across transboundary borders is important to understand. If I, as a community, is managing water the resources that I can see fit, I may be having an unfortunate effect on other people elsewhere. There's no one simple solution, unfortunately, all this sort of stuff. And I think, as everyone suggested, getting information is costly and difficult. It does lead to better decisions. There's no silver bullet, and it's always expensive to do. I know when I first started the work we did in the Murray-Darling Basin, the information was incredibly lax and rubbery, to say the best. It took for us a massive drought for the basin to almost completely and utterly collapse in 2007 before a vast amount of investment was made in getting data. That's improved the systems enormously, far better understanding what's going on. What maybe we need to do is hit up Bill Gates and see if he's got some money to actually do some of this stuff worldwide. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of. But, local communities do definitely need to say, but understanding who has those rights, especially when it comes to common property. And please, let's not introduce Harden here, who's misunderstood what the commons were.
It's not necessarily a tragedy, right?
Oh, well-defined rights. Sorry, open access versus common property is very different to say, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We do have actually Swapna, sorry if I'm saying your name correctly, has commented in the open forum about GRACE data, and that's true. So GRACE is a satellite data system, and we now have a picture of groundwater depleted areas. And these areas may be targeted for groundwater management at a watershed or catchment scale. And there is work going on now. Maybe some of you know more about GRACE than I do, but there's work going on now to downscale, if you want, the GRACE data, because it's sort of continental scale rather than watershed scale. So for developing countries, there are some of those data sources, large scale data sources available also. Simon, do you have a comment?
Yeah. I could say that I was one of those persons who used or checked out GRACE data, as I think we were looking at the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam when we were looking at it. One of the challenges though is that it is great for large areas, but when it comes to high resolution for smaller areas, it is not very applicable. And thus for large land masses, it comes in as a great resource, a great tool, because you can see the movement of water, or when you have a lot of recharge or depletion. Wherever in smaller scales like island scales, you don't get much, it's not very reliable, or it's not a great tool for smaller scales at high resolution.
Simon, can I ask you a question quickly? I noticed on Delta Island there were actually two aquifers. You have the sandy aquifer and then the karst aquifer. And so was your study mostly on the sandy aquifer, or did you also look at the karst aquifer?
We looked at we looked at the whole system, because we did electrical soundings in both soil, in the sands, and in the karst zones, where you had that thin layer of just more clay dirt above it. And all the information that we get from it is, I mean, we all know it's a point source with electrical soundings, right? But there's a Sarapiti well field that is a karst, is actually it's a karst aquifer. That's where you have a lot of karst. And that gave us one of our largest deposits of water on the island. Mm-hmm. However, it's not much, you can't do much surveying on the whole landmass, because after you go through maybe a 4 or 5 feet, it's literally elevated karst all on the surface. So you can't get any sort of, you can't use the same method to get more information on it. You'll have to change your method of geophysical surveying, maybe using a LiDAR or another one to get more information in the karst regions, more karstified areas, sorry.
Thank you.
So we're almost at time. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Renee Martin-Nagel to make a few closing remarks. Renee's a treasurer of the IWRA, a special counsel at Eckert Siemens, and a president and CEO of Ripple Effect. Her multidisciplinary PhD research at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow focused on governance of offshore fresh groundwater, and her master's thesis suggested that fossil aquifers be considered the common heritage of mankind. Recently, she led the governance chapter for the UN University book Unconventional Water Resources, and served as an expert reviewer for the 2022 IPCC 6th assessment report. So Renee's going to provide some closing remarks just before I turn it back over to Nevena to close out the webinar. But I'd like to personally thank all of the presenters for your excellent presentations and for the discussion.
And thank you so much, Mary. Thank you for everything that you've done to bring this conference to light. My closing remarks are just going to be things that we all know, and that is in a time of climate change with more evaporation of surface water, there's going to be increased reliance on groundwater. And we're seeing the groundwater tables decline. And so how do we incentivize less use of groundwater? We heard from David that use of groundwater is economically makes sense for agriculture as surface water is disappearing. And I think that could probably be true in many areas of use of groundwater. But how do we preserve it for future generations? And how do we incentivize less use? So it's probably a combination of things. I do think there could be economic incentives, but also there has to be policy incentives. And then people have to realize that if they don't utilize groundwater more sustainably and more sensibly, then there won't be groundwater to use in the future. And data is critical. And we call groundwater the invisible resource because it's underground, and people think that you can continue using it and it will always be there, but that's not true. And gathering data is expensive. Australia is a developed nation, and it still took a crisis in order to have resources available for monitoring. So where do we go in the future? I think greater awareness of the value of groundwater and its fragility will help. And we need to get the data out there however we can, and then try to incentivize people to act individually and collectively to protect our groundwater resources. And I think I'll close with that because we're coming to the end of our time.
Thank you so much, Renee. Thank you for this wonderful and very insightful webinar. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our panelists and our moderator, Dr. Trudeau, and a special thank you to our guest, Dr. Renee Martin-Nagel. If you'd like to find out more about IWRA and you would like to join the membership of the association, please visit our website, which is www.iwra.org. Also, please note that we will be sharing the recording of the webinar in the coming days. And our second webinar on global water security issues will be held on the 27th of September at 3 p.m. Central European time. More details will become available shortly. And on behalf of the whole IWRA office, and IWRA board membership. We thank you very much for viewing this webinar. Over to you, Mary.
Yeah, so I'll just close it again with thank you to the panel. Please reference the UNESCO library, look for the recording of this webinar, and look for more details on our next webinar on the GWSI, and also IWRA hosts webinars frequently about all kinds of issues related to the water policy link. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.